3 months had passed since Park Semin made her accusation in the Grand Convocation Hall, and the galaxy had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The Valorian Empire had not fallen, but it had broken. Krethvoss was deposed by a coalition of reformists who understood that survival required change, and half the subject worlds had declared independence in the chaos that followed. And the bioreactor program had ended not through Valorian choice, but because the species who operated the facilities had refused to continue their work now. Representatives from 63 species gathered aboard the Niral Station Meridian Point to negotiate a new framework for galactic relations. And Ambassador Park Semin stood at the center of discussions that would shape civilization for centuries to come. She looked older than she had 3 months ago, and the weight of what she had set in motion showed in the lines around her eyes and the gray that had appeared in her dark hair. But her voice remained steady as she addressed the assembly. "We are here because a truth was spoken that could no longer be hidden," she said. "And we are here because the galaxy responded to that truth with more courage than I dared to hope." The delegations listened in silence, and Park noted that many of the species present had never before sat at the same table. The Movari floated beside the Dreth, who had nearly been their enemies. The Vorathi shared space with former Valorian client states. Even representatives from the reformed Valorian government were present, though they sat apart from the others and bore the shame of their empire's crimes on their bent shoulders. Humanity does not claim the right to judge other civilizations, Park continued, because we know our own history too well to pretend we are without sin. She thought of the atrocities humans had committed against each other throughout their brief existence, and she felt the humility that came from honest self-examination. "But we believe that some principles must be universal," she said. "And we believe that the harvesting of sentient beings is a violation of those principles, regardless of who commits it or why." The Keth Syndicate representative raised an objection. "Your principles are admirable in theory," he chimed, "but they offer no solution to the practical problems facing the former empire. And millions will suffer if their energy grid collapses." Park nodded in acknowledgement. "You are correct that principles alone cannot power cities," she replied. "And that is why humanity has worked with the Movari and the Dreth to develop a transition assistance program." She activated a holographic display showing technical schematics and resource allocations. "We are offering fusion reactor technology and construction assistance to any Valorian world that commits to ending all harvesting operations immediately," she said. "And we are asking other species to contribute what they can to ensure the transition succeeds." The display showed pledges from dozens of worlds, and the combined resources represented the largest cooperative effort in galactic history. "This will not be easy," Park admitted, "and it will not be fast. And there will be hardship during the transition." She looked directly at the Valorian delegation. "But hardship is not the same as genocide," she said. "And the inconvenience of change does not justify the continuation of murder." The negotiations continued for days, and Park participated in countless meetings and debates and compromises. Some species wanted harsh punishment for the Valorians, and others wanted to pretend the crisis had never happened. And finding middle ground required patience that she often struggled to maintain. But slowly a framework emerged. The Sentience Protection Compact would establish universal protections for pre-spaceflight species, and an independent monitoring body would ensure compliance. And the reformed Valorian government would cooperate with investigations into historical crimes. It was not perfect justice, and many who had participated in the harvesting program would never face consequences. And the billions who had died would never receive the recognition they deserved. But it was a beginning. On the final day of negotiations, the Assembly voted on the compact. The result was narrow, and several species abstained. And some voted against, but the majority said yes. Park felt tears running down her face as the results were announced. And she did not try to hide them after the formal ceremony. Tessek approached her in the corridor outside the assembly chamber. The Dreth Diplomat had been named ambassador to the new Galactic Cooperation Council, and his role in distributing the evidence had made him a hero to reformists across the galaxy. "I have been thinking about what you asked me in that detention suite," he said. Park remembered the data chip and the fear in his eyes when he took it. "I asked you to decide what kind of galaxy you wanted to live in." "Yes," Tessek agreed. "And I have been wondering whether I made the right choice." Park studied his scaled face and tried to read his expression. "Do you regret it?" "I regret the cost," Tessek replied, "because many Dreth died in the conflicts that followed the revelation, and some of my closest friends were among them." He paused, and his slit pupils widened with emotion. "But I do not regret the choice itself," he continued, "because my people owe their existence to fortune, and fortune is wasted if it is not used to help others escape the fate we avoided." Park placed her hand on his scaled arm in a gesture of solidarity. "The cost was real," she said, "and the dead deserve to be mourned, and I will carry guilt for my role in what happened for the rest of my life." She looked out a window at the stars that burned in the void beyond the station. "But I still believe that some truths must be spoken regardless of the cost," she said, "because the alternative is becoming complicit in evil, and complicity corrupts the soul in ways that violence never can." Tessek nodded slowly. "Your species is strange," he observed, "and you often make decisions that seem irrational to older civilizations." A hint of warmth entered his hissing voice. "But perhaps that strangeness is valuable," he continued, "because rationality alone cannot build a just society. And sometimes wisdom comes from those who are too young to know what they are risking." He offered her the formal Dreth gesture of farewell between honored equals. "May your species never lose its capacity for outrage," he said, "and may you always find the courage to speak truths that others fear to acknowledge." Park returned the gesture with human modifications that Tessek would understand. "And may your people always remember how close they came," she replied. "And may that memory give them strength to stand with the vulnerable." She watched him walk away and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle onto her shoulders. Humanity was no longer an unknown species on the edge of galactic civilization. They had made themselves known. And they had done it not through military power or economic influence, but through the simple act of speaking an uncomfortable truth. Whether that made them admired or feared would depend on choices not yet made. And Park knew that the work of building a better galaxy would continue long after she was gone. But today, at least, the harvesting had ended today. At least, the truth had been spoken. And today, at least, a young species had proven that courage could change the stars. Park walked toward the human delegation's quarters and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new compromises and new truths that needed speaking, but that was tomorrow. Tonight she would rest and remember the technician who had started everything with his dying confession, and she would honor his memory by continuing the work he had entrusted to her. The galaxy was watching humanity now. She intended to give them something worth watching. 1 week after Park Semin made her accusation, the Grand Convocation Hall reconvened with half its seats empty. 7 species had formally withdrawn from the Valorian alliance, and 3 more had demanded reparations for their unknowing complicity in the harvesting program. And the great chamber that had once symbolized imperial unity now felt hollow and abandoned. Park stood before the reduced assembly as a prisoner awaiting judgment, and she noted that the species still present were those most dependent on Valorian protection, or those most deeply compromised by their own involvement in the program. Krethvos presided from his elevated podium. But something in his posture had changed. He no longer projected absolute confidence, and his movements carried a tension that suggested a creature pushed toward the edge of reason. The human ambassador will explain how she obtained classified imperial documents, he commanded, and she will reveal her co-conspirators within our government. Park clasped her hands behind her back and met his gaze without fear. I obtained the documents from a dying technician who could no longer bear the weight of his conscience, she said. And I verified them through my own investigation of discrepancies in your public energy reports. You committed espionage against a sovereign power. I investigated crimes against sentient beings, Park replied. And I followed evidence wherever it led. Krethvos descended from his podium with jerky movements that suggested fury barely contained. You are not a court, he hissed. And you have no authority to investigate anything within our borders. No, Park agreed. But I am a witness, and witnesses have a duty to speak truth, even when that truth threatens the powerful. The hall fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the assembly. Krethvos turned away from her and addressed the remaining delegates. The Empire offers a compromise, he announced. And I extend this offer once as a gesture of our commitment to galactic stability. He produced a holographic display showing a complex timeline. Humanity will publicly retract these accusations and admit to fabricating evidence, he said. And in exchange, the harvesting program will be phased out over the next standard century. And no further action will be taken against human interests. Park felt disgust rise in her throat. You want me to lie, she said, so that you can continue murdering primitives for another 100 years. I want you to accept a practical solution. Krethvos replied, because idealism cannot feed an empire, and the energy grid was never designed to function without the bioreactors. A Valorian scientist in the gallery rose to confirm the Archon's claim. Our projections indicate catastrophic grid failure within 2 decades if harvesting ceases immediately, he said. And the transition to alternative energy sources will require time and resources that will strain our economy. Park looked around the hall at the species who had chosen to remain aligned with the Empire. And she saw calculation in their eyes. They were weighing the lives of primitive beings. They would never meet against the stability of an economic system that benefited them directly, and she could see that many of them were prepared to accept a compromise. How many? She asked quietly. Krethvos tilted his head in confusion. How many what? How many beings would die during your century of transition? Park said. And how many worlds would you empty while you slowly build alternatives? You should have built millennia ago. The Archon's mandibles clicked in irritation. Irrelevant. Not irrelevant, Park replied, and her voice grew stronger, because those beings are sentient, and they experience fear and pain and love for their children, and they deserve to be counted. She turned to face the assembly directly. I have seen your records, she continued, and I know you harvested between 8 and 12 million beings per standard year. And if that continues for another century, the death toll will exceed 1 billion. Murmurs spread through the remaining delegates. 1 billion people, Park repeated. Who will be born and who will live brief lives and who will be taken from their worlds and processed into fuel for your cities. She pointed at the empty seats where withdrawn delegations had once sat. And every species that stays aligned with this empire will share responsibility for those deaths, she said. Because silence in the face of genocide is complicity, and complicity is guilt. Krethvos had heard enough. Your moralizing changes nothing, he snarled. And humanity lacks the power to enforce your principles. And your fleet is a collection of primitive vessels that our battle groups could destroy in a single engagement. He gestured to his guards. This farce ends now, he declared. And the human ambassador will be executed for espionage. and her species will learn what happens to those who challenge Valorian authority. Guards moved toward Park, and she felt the cold certainty of death approaching. Then a communication alert chimed throughout the hall, and every display screen flickered to show an incoming transmission from beyond Imperial space. Admiral Chelminsiok appeared on the screens, and behind him, Park could see the bridge of the human flagship Resolute. "This message is being broadcast on all frequencies to every species in the known galaxy," he announced, "and it contains complete copies of the evidence gathered by Ambassador Park Sumin regarding Valorian harvesting operations." Krethvos roared in fury and ordered his technicians to block the transmission. But the signal had already propagated beyond their ability to contain. "Humanity has no quarrel with the Valorian people," Cho continued, "but we cannot remain silent while sentient beings are slaughtered for fuel. And we call upon all species who value life and dignity to stand with us in demanding accountability." The screen showed a map of galactic space, and Park watched as lights began appearing across the display. Each light represented a species that had received the transmission and was now broadcasting it further. Within minutes, the evidence had spread across half the known galaxy. Krethvos stood frozen as his empire crumbled around him in real time, and the guards who had been moving toward Park stopped in confusion. The High Archon turned to face her with hatred burning in his compound eyes. "You have destroyed 12,000 years of civilization," he said. Park looked at the screens, showing the spreading lights of truth, and felt something like hope kindle in her chest. "No," she replied. "I have given the galaxy a choice about what kind of civilization they want to build." She stepped closer to the towering Archon and spoke words that she knew would echo through history. "Your empire chose to survive through murder," she said, "and now every species in existence will decide whether that choice is acceptable." Krethvos raised his manipulators as if to strike her down, and for a moment Park believed he would kill her with his own hands. Then he lowered them and turned away. "Prepare my shuttle," he commanded his guards, and summoned the War Council. He paused at the exit and looked back at the human ambassador, who had brought his empire to its knees. "This is not over," he promised. Park watched him go, and knew that he was right. The accusation had been made, and the evidence had been shared, and the galaxy had begun to react. But the real reckoning was still to come. The data spread faster than anyone had anticipated, and within 3 days, the galaxy had begun to tear itself apart. Tesek had distributed copies of the chip to 14 delegations before Imperial security realized what was happening, and by then the evidence had already been transmitted to homeworlds across a dozen sectors. Park watched the chaos unfold through her detention suite's news feeds, and she felt both vindicated and terrified by what she had set in motion. The Mulvari Collective was the first to respond officially, and their floating ambassador had addressed the emergency session of the convocation hall with words that shook the foundations of galactic diplomacy. "We have examined the records provided by the human delegation," Ambassador Peleth announced, their tentacles waving in patterns that translated to profound distress. "And we have found references to 3 worlds within our protected sphere that were designated for harvesting before we established territorial claims." The hall erupted in chaos for the second time in a week. "These worlds contain primitive species we have been observing for scientific purposes," Peleth continued once order was restored. "And we have documentation proving these species still exist, because our protection prevented Imperial harvesters from reaching them." Park watched Krethvos struggle to maintain his composure as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled around him. "The Mulvari Collective demands an immediate and independent investigation," Peleth declared, "and we demand that all harvesting operations cease pending the results of that investigation." The Keth Syndicate representative rose to counter the accusation. and his crystalline body chimed with dismissive harmonics. The humans have fabricated this evidence to destabilize the Alliance network, he claimed. And the Malvari are naive to accept such obvious propaganda at face value. But even as he spoke, Park noticed that several other delegations were quietly departing the hall. They had seen the evidence, and they had made their calculations, and they had decided that distance from the Kong Empire was worth more than continued partnership. The Dreth Confederation formally suspended all treaty obligations pending investigation. The Vorathi Assembly withdrew their ambassador entirely. The Talani Dominion, longtime rivals of the Empire, began broadcasting the harvesting records across every frequency they controlled, and in the lower districts of Threnos Prime, ordinary Valorian citizens started asking questions that had never been asked before. Park learned about the protests from a guard who forgot to mute his communication device, and she heard the sounds of crowds gathering in the commercial districts, and she heard the confusion in official announcements that tried to dismiss the accusations as alien lies. Not all Valorians had known what their empire was built upon. Many had genuinely believed the propaganda about biological waste processing and sustainable energy production, and they were now confronting the reality that their prosperity had been purchased with the lives of billions of sentient beings. Park wondered how they would respond to that knowledge. Some would deny it and cling to comfortable lies. Some would justify it with arguments about necessity and progress, but some would be horrified. And those were the ones who might change everything. Krethvoss appeared on the news feeds to address the growing crisis, and his speech was a masterwork of deflection and accusation. Humanity has committed an act of war through espionage and slander, he declared, and the Empire will respond with appropriate measures to defend our honor and our sovereignty. Park felt cold fear settle in her stomach as reports came in about Imperial fleet movements. 12 battle groups were converging on the border between Valorian space and human territory, and their combined firepower was enough to reduce Earth to a cinder. Admiral Cho Min-seok had positioned his fleet to intercept, but the human navy was young and small and hopelessly outmatched. This was the moment Park had feared since she first read those files. She had known the Empire might choose war rather than accountability, and she had gambled that the Alliance network would fracture fast enough to prevent an overwhelming strike. Now she watched the pieces move across a galactic board and prayed that her gamble would pay off. The Malvari fleet repositioned to block the most direct route between Valorian space and human territory, and their ambassador announced that any Imperial vessel passing through their sphere would be considered an act of aggression. The Dreth began evacuating their diplomatic personnel from Threnos Prime. The Vorathi mobilized their defensive forces for the first time in 2 centuries, and deep within the Empire itself, cracks were spreading through the Foundation. Park received an unexpected visitor on the 4th day of her detention, and she recognized him immediately as a high-ranking member of the Valorian Council. His name was Verithmos, and his exoskeleton bore the markings of the scientific caste, and his compound eyes held an expression she could only interpret as profound shame. "I helped design the processing systems," he said without preamble, "and I spent 300 years improving their efficiency." Park said nothing and waited for him to continue. "I told myself it was necessary," Verithmos continued, "and I told myself the primitives were not truly aware in the way we are aware, and I told myself that our civilization's needs outweighed their suffering." He lowered his massive head in a gesture that seemed almost human. "I was lying to myself," he admitted, "and I have always known I was lying, and your accusation has forced me to acknowledge what I helped create." Park studied him carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because there are others like me," Verithmos replied. and we have been silent for too long. And some of us believe the time for silence has ended. He produced a data crystal from within his robes. This contains the locations of every active harvesting facility, he said. And it contains the access codes that will allow investigators to enter those facilities. And it contains testimony from 17 Valorian officials who are prepared to confirm your accusations. Park took the crystal with trembling hands. The High Archon will consider this treason. Yes, Varithmos agreed. But perhaps treason against an unjust empire is not truly treason at all. He turned toward the door and paused. Your species is very young, he said. And you do not yet understand how easy it is to become complicit in evil through small compromises repeated over centuries. His compound eyes met hers with something that might have been respect. Do not lose the capacity for outrage, he said, because that capacity is more valuable than any weapon your fleets might carry. He left, and Park sat alone with a crystal that contained the keys to the Empire's darkest secrets. She did not know if she would live to see those secrets exposed, but she knew that the truth was now beyond the Empire's ability to contain. The fire she had lit was spreading, and even Krethvos could not burn fast enough to stay ahead of it. The detention suite was nicer than Park Sumin had expected, and she supposed the Empire still cared about appearances even when holding foreign diplomats prisoner. She sat on a cushioned bench that had been adjusted to human proportions and stared through a window that showed the glittering spires of Threnos Prime, stretching toward a purple sky somewhere out there. Her accusation was spreading through diplomatic channels like poison in a bloodstream. Her guards were professional and silent, and they brought her food that had been tested for compatibility with human biology. And they allowed her to pace the suite's 3 rooms without interference. She was a prisoner. But she was a prisoner being treated with careful respect. That told her the Empire was not yet ready to escalate beyond the point of no return. 3 months earlier, she had stood in very different quarters on a moon called Vertex 7. The dying technician's name had been Kreltos, and he had been so old that his exoskeleton had turned from black to brittle gray, and his voice had crackled through failing vocal membranes as he told her things that no human had ever heard. I was young when they assigned me to the processing facility on Draven's world, he had said, and I believed everything they told us about the work. Park had recorded every word while pretending to conduct a routine inspection of the outposts, communication systems. They called them resources. Kreltos continued, and they said the primitives were not truly sentient because they had not achieved spaceflight. And we believed because believing was easier than questioning. His manipulators had trembled as he accessed files that should have been locked behind encryption no civilian could break. But I watched them die, he whispered, and I heard them scream in languages we did not bother to translate. And I saw the way they held their young as we separated them for processing. Park had felt sick in ways she had not experienced since her first war crimes investigation. On a colony world torn apart by civil conflict. Why? Are you telling me this? She had asked. Because humans are new, Kreltos replied. And you have not yet learned to look away from things that make you uncomfortable. And I'm dying and I need someone to know what I helped do. He had uploaded decades of records to her device before Imperial Security arrived to investigate her extended visit. She never learned what happened to him after she left. But she suspected he had not lived long enough to see his confession reach its intended audience. Now Park sat in her comfortable prison and wondered if his sacrifice would mean anything. A soft chime announced a visitor, and the suite's door slid open to reveal a figure she recognized from the Grand Convocation Hall. Tessek of the Dreth Confederation entered with movements that seemed designed to project calm while concealing fear, and his scaled body was dressed in the diplomatic robes of a neutral observer rather than an allied. Representative Ambassador Park, he said. his translator rendering his hissing speech into careful formality. "I hope you will forgive this unofficial visit." Park rose and offered the greeting gesture she had learned during her diplomatic training. "Representative Tesek," she replied. "I am grateful for any company in my current circumstances." Tesek glanced at the guards stationed outside the suite, and something in his posture suggested he was about to take a significant risk. "I wish to discuss your accusation," he said. In a purely hypothetical context that carries no official weight, Park understood immediately. "Of course," she said. "Purely hypothetical." Tesek lowered his voice and leaned closer than dress social customs normally permitted. "Hypothetically," he began, "if a species had once been considered for inclusion in certain imperial programs before they achieved spaceflight, and if that species had only avoided such inclusion through a fortunate accident of early technological development, that species might have strong feelings about the accusations you have made." Park felt her heart rate increase as she processed his words. The Dreth were on the list. She said, "Hypothetically, what happened?" Tesek's scales shifted in a pattern she had learned to recognize as distress. "Our world experienced a volcanic event that destroyed our largest cities and killed 60% of our population," he said. "And the Empire decided we were no longer worth harvesting because our numbers had fallen too low to be economically viable." He paused, and his slit pupils dilated with emotion. 20 years later, we launched our first spacecraft, and the Empire welcomed us as fellow sentients worthy of diplomatic relations. And none of us knew how close we had come to extinction. Park thought about the file she had memorized, and she remembered seeing references to a species designated DT7 that had been removed from active harvesting schedules due to population collapse. "I have the records," she said quietly. Tesek stared at her with an intensity that seemed to burn through his careful diplomatic mask. "Can you prove it?" "I can prove everything," Park replied, "but only if the evidence reaches the other delegations before the Empire can suppress it." She reached into her diplomatic pouch and retrieved a data chip no larger than her thumbnail. "This contains copies of 8,000 years of harvesting records," she said, "including species designations and population statistics and processing schedules." Tesek looked at the chip and then looked at the door where Imperial guards stood waiting. "If I am caught carrying that," he said, "my species will face consequences we cannot survive. I know. And yet you ask me to take it." Park held the chip toward him and met his gaze with absolute honesty. "I am asking you to decide what kind of galaxy you want to live in," she said. "And I am asking you to decide whether the risk of action is greater than the cost of silence." Tesek stood motionless for a long moment, and Park could see the war playing out behind his eyes as fear battled against something that might have been hope or might have been rage. Then, his clawed hand closed around the data chip. "My people owe their existence to a volcano," he said, "and we have spent centuries wondering why fortune spared us when so many others must have perished." He tucked the chip into a hidden pocket within his robes. "Perhaps fortune was waiting for us to earn our survival." He turned toward the door and paused with his hand on the release panel. "Your aid has been transmitting emergency signals toward human space," he said, "and the Empire is jamming most frequencies, but some messages have gotten through." Park felt a surge of hope that she quickly suppressed. "Earth knows. Earth knows," Tesek confirmed. "And Admiral Cho Minseok has positioned his fleet at the edge of Valorian territory." He opened the door and stepped into the corridor. "Whether that fleet can protect you or your species remains to be seen," he said. "But you will not face what comes alone." The door closed behind him, and Park returned to her seat by the window. She watched the spires of the Imperial capital glitter in the fading light and wondered how many of them had been built with energy harvested From genocide tomorrow, the galaxy would begin to learn the truth. She hoped it would be strong enough to survive the knowledge. The Grand Convocation Hall stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian floor. And Ambassador Park Semin had never felt smaller in her entire life. She walked between columns that rose like frozen lightning toward a ceiling so high it vanished into artificial clouds. And every step echoed against stone older than human civilization itself. Representatives from 47 species filled the tiered galleries around her, their bodies ranging from insectoid to crystalline to forms she could not begin to classify. And all of them watched the lone human approach the central speaking platform. Park kept her spine straight and her face neutral despite the weight of their attention. She had served as a war crimes investigator for 15 years before joining the diplomatic corps, and she had learned to hide her emotions behind a mask of professional calm. Today, she would need every bit of that training. High Archon Krethvos dominated the supreme podium at the far end of the hall, his segmented body rising 4 meters tall on 6 powerful legs, and his compound eyes reflected Park's image 1,000 times over. The Valorian Empire had ruled this sector of the galaxy for 12,000 years, and Krethvos had led them for the last 3 centuries. He was old and powerful and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. "We welcome the representative of humanity to these proceedings," Krethvos announced, his translator rendering his clicking speech into melodic tones. "And we look forward to discussing expanded trade agreements between our great civilization and your emerging species." Park bowed precisely as protocol demanded and took her place at the human delegation's small platform. Her aide, Yoon-Jihye, stood behind her with a tablet containing their prepared remarks about shipping routes and tariff reductions. None of those remarks would be delivered. Today, the summit proceeded through its opening ceremonies with glacial formality, and Park used the time to study the other delegations. The Dreth occupied a middle tier, their scaled bodies hunched in postures she had learned to read as uncomfortable, and their lead diplomat kept glancing toward the Valorian podium with what looked like fear in his slit-pupiled eyes. The Malvari floated in atmosphere bubbles near the ceiling, their tentacles curled tight against their bodies in what she knew was a defensive posture. Something felt wrong in this hall beyond the normal tension of galactic politics. These species were afraid, and not of the humans. Krethvos began his keynote address, and holographic displays materialized throughout the hall showing charts and figures. Celebrating imperial prosperity, energy production had increased by 12% over the previous decade, and new colonies were thriving across 100 worlds. And the bioreactor network continued to exceed all projections. Park felt her blood turn cold when she saw those words. Bioreactor network. 3 months ago, she had stood in a dying technician's quarters on a border moon and watched him upload encrypted files to her personal device with trembling manipulators. He had been Valorian, and he had been old, and he had been drowning in guilt that had festered for 200 years. "You must know what we have done," he had whispered through failing translation software. "And you must tell the galaxy, because none of us have the courage." She had spent weeks breaking his encryption, and what she found inside had stolen her sleep and haunted her waking hours. The bioreactors did not run on biological waste as the Empire claimed. They ran on people, primitive species from worlds that had not yet achieved spaceflight, were harvested by the millions, their bodies processed into fuel for an empire that preached civilization while practicing genocide on an industrial scale. Park had the evidence stored in 3 separate locations, and she had transmitted copies to Earth before leaving for this summit. And she had known since the moment she finished reading those files that her career and possibly her life would end today. But some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of the cost. Krethvos finished his presentation, to polite applause from the loyal delegations and uncomfortable silence from others. We now open the floor to our distinguished guests, he announced, beginning with the representative from Earth. Park rose from her seat and felt Jihai's hand brush her arm in a gesture of confusion and concern. She had not told her aide what she planned to do because she wanted to protect at least one human in this room from the consequences. Honored Archon, Park began, her voice carrying through the hall's perfect acoustics, and distinguished representatives of the galactic community, I thank you for this opportunity to address such an august gathering. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled species. I must confess that I will not be delivering my prepared remarks on trade agreements today because I have a matter of far greater importance to discuss. Krethvos shifted on his podium, and his compound eyes focused on her with sudden intensity. Proceed, he said, though his tone had grown wary. 3 months ago, Park continued, I received classified intelligence regarding the true nature of the Valorian bioreactor network that powers your empire. The hall fell absolutely silent. I have spent considerable time verifying this intelligence, she said, and I stand before you today to make an accusation that I do not make lightly. She drew a breath and felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The Valorian Empire has been systematically harvesting sentient beings from pre-spaceflight worlds to fuel their energy infrastructure, she declared. And this practice has continued for over 8,000 years. Chaos erupted through the Grand Convocation Hall. Delegates rose from their platforms, shouting in languages their translators struggled to process. And some species began moving toward the exits, while others surged toward the human platform. And a carefully maintained order of imperial proceedings shattered like glass against stone. Silence, Krethvos roared, and his voice cut through the noise with the weight of absolute authority. The hall fell still, though tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. You dare, the High Archon hissed, his translator barely containing his fury, to stand in the heart of our empire and level such accusations against a civilization that flourished when your ancestors were painting on cave walls. Park met his thousand-eyed gaze without flinching. I dare, she replied, because I have evidence. Then produce it. I will provide my evidence to an independent tribunal, Park said. Not to the accused party. Krethvos descended from his podium with movements that seemed too fluid for his massive frame, and he crossed the obsidian floor until he stood directly before the human platform. Retract your accusation, he commanded, and we will attribute this outburst to cultural misunderstanding and inexperience. And you may leave this hall with your life and your species' diplomatic standing intact. Park looked up at the towering alien and thought about the file she had read, and she thought about the billions of primitive sentients who had vanished into Valorian processing facilities, and she thought about what it would mean to stay silent. I will not retract, she said. Krethvos turned to the Imperial guards who flanked the hall. Detain the human ambassador pending investigation into this slander, he ordered, and notify the fleet commanders that the species called humanity has chosen to make enemies of the Valorian Empire. Guards surrounded Park's platform as Jihai frantically transmitted emergency signals toward Earth's nearest outpost. Park allowed herself to be taken into custody without resistance, and as they led her from the Grand Convocation Hall, she looked back at the assembled delegates. Some watched with horror and some with calculation, and some with something that looked almost like hope. She had lit a fire today. Now she would see how far it spread.